samples, pollen, botanical samples, sediment samples, will hopefully give us some idea about what it was that was at this location that attracted them to this place. In somewhat later times, we have people who came to be in the forest or the growing forest, when the forest started to grow in this area. I got distracted again. I haven't worked out all the details of this, so I'm having a little bit of a problem here. I got the outline, but I didn't fill in the blanks. There's too much noise.
I think the people is one of the most, I mean, thinking about the people that would watch the video, and the story that it's telling, it always is nice to have that connection, especially when it is just stones and dirt.
Yeah.
What do you have over there? Just that one unit, but it's 8 inch. I got about 6 more levels. So what kind of material do you have over there? Shelter material? You still have the big tube? No,
I can go back and say a little, I mean, this can be patched together and will be, so as it goes back and forth. One of the things I wanted to, all we have here are the dirt and the stones. The stones are very interesting. Some are very shiny and colorful, and certainly are attractive to look at, more so than some of the other stones, which are very, very heavily weathered, and are the kind of stones that really only professional archaeologists, or as we say, only Rob could love. He's a flint knapper. But there's a variety of both of them, and from what we can tell so far, they're rather old. Some of them are very old. They may date to 8,000 years in time. Some of them are somewhat more recent, in the 4,000 to 6,000 year category. So far, we only know that from the styles of the actual objects, such as projectile points, arrowheads, if you will, that have been found here. We don't have any tools that one might call recent prehistoric, tools that were made in the last 2,000 years. Perhaps this is because we are only excavating a very small portion of a much larger place, of a much larger community. And what we are doing is excavating only the very oldest portion of that large community. I think this has to do with how people have come here, how they use this land, and how they continue to be interested in it. In the post-glacial times, we don't exactly know why people came here. We hope to extract that in a variety of ways, from pollen, from botanical materials, from sediments, basically from the soil, from what the soil contains, what the soil can tell us. In somewhat less ancient times, when forests grew up in this area, the forests that you can see around you today are only a small reflection of the large trees that used to be here. If you look around the landscape, there are some very, very large stumps, truly old growth trees. These would have been here for 3,000 to 4,000 years, while people also, again, or still use this place. The tool changes are something we haven't defined yet. We're still excavating. Once we go through the analysis process, we should be able to set up a sequence of the different kinds of tools, the different kinds of objects that may have been used in any given period in time at different locations around the site. As we come to more recent times, in what is called a recent prehistoric, we might actually have to leave this landform to find where people had their major activities, where they lived, and where they buried their dead. We are on a high terrace, a terrace that is now 300.
Stop at high terrace, and I have to move you out of the sun a little bit.
Oh. Okay.
Thinking
Yeah, there's a,
move towards K, you'd be a little bit
nope, it's the tree.
that's
Okay.
that's better. And then I'm gonna have to shift a tiny bit here too.
You know, I thought I heard something down there. Was that you?
Is there
Now I know where you were.
anything about those where those rivers come together that would have was that when do you think that happened? Those rivers.
That is a particularly
Just
nice
curious about that.
Oh, I don't know when the rivers might have come together. I do know that in post-glacial times there were lots of different channels and channeling through here. You can tell that if you take a really good close look at a USGS map, that this particular terrace is at a similar level with several others in the vicinity, forming a
Okay. Actually, we can start over, and because I interrupted you and had you move when you were talking about how this terrace was,
Okay.
where it is now.
The terrace that we're on now is 300 feet above the current flow of the Tolt River. It is quite likely that in more recent times, and by recent I mean in an archaeological sense, recent prehistoric, so that would take us 300-400 years ago, people would have lived closer to the river than here. They would have had a lot of activities that may have been closer to the river. However, on the edge of the terrace, which is beyond the area of excavation, it's quite likely that there's a trail. We've seen little hints of it in the process of surveying the property, but we are not investigating it as part of this project.
They're actually not constructed. So we spent all this time reviewing a proposed project. The institution is saying that they're actually in a position where they're designing fictitious buildings just to preserve that extra square footage. Okay. So what we feel is that right now the institutions, if they want to change their master plan and all the projects that they were proposing, they have to come into DCRU and go through an amendment process. An amendment is determined to be either major or minor. And there have been complaints that amendment process takes too long, especially for a major amendment. A major amendment requires council approval. We think that because there's going to be a lot less speculation up front about what's in that master plan, that there will be significantly fewer number of amendments in the future. There'll still be amendments required if you're going to change your transportation management goals, or if you're going to change the development standards like the height or the boundaries, that'll still require amendment. But in most cases, changes to future development won't require an amendment under the changes that we're proposing. Another one of the big issues has to do with the limits on major institution uses outside of, but within 2,500 feet of the boundaries of the major institution. And I like to refer to that as the impact area. And right now, the major institution, by adopting an overlay zone for their campus, they can get extra development potential. They can actually go to higher heights or develop more buildings than would be allowed by the underlying zoning. But in exchange for that, they're limited in how much space they can own or lease or develop in the area immediately surrounding the campus. We're proposing that the council actually adopt two alternatives for what happens in this area, the impact area.
Then who gets to choose?
The institution would propose one or the other. For some institutions, they don't lease any space, or they don't own any space within 2,500 feet of their boundaries. For other institutions, it's a big issue for them.
They would propose it, let me just clarify, because I had the same question, in their master plan.
In their master
and
plan.
so it would be approved by the council in the master plan for institution X to say, here are the regulations for you outside your boundaries. So it wouldn't be a few years later that they start looking and saying, which one of these works best for us?
Yeah. The first alternative is basically status quo. It retains the current regulations, which is a square footage limitation of 40,000 square feet in that impact area, but it allows for additional flexibility through the neighborhood planning process. The second alternative actually eliminates that 40,000 square foot limit. No limit would be subject to the underlying zoning, but it allows through that master planning process or through neighborhood planning, putting limitations on the location of major institution uses at the street level. And a perfect example where that's already happening is at Swedish Hospital along Madison, where that's currently a pedestrian designated zone. So the major institution uses can't be at the street level, and instead along Madison there you have some of the retail and restaurant uses. That preserves the street level spaces for other businesses, and that's something that's important for the residents that live in that area and for the neighborhood business community. Obviously the institution could occupy space at the second level. But what we're saying is that the institution and the Citizens Advisory Committee could propose what streets they would want those limits on. Another recommendation we're proposing is to eliminate the expiration date for a master plan. Currently, a master plan expires either 10 or 15 years after the council adopts it. And in a lot of cases, by the time these plans expire, a lot of the development never happens. And what we're proposing is if you're in that situation, why should the master plan expire? And the situation in the surrounding neighborhood may not have changed either.
Didn't we just tinker with that last year? The major development.
That, I think, was for major phase development,
That's what it was.
Similar kind of.
Yeah.
which is for large commercial projects.
Yeah,
But
over a
it's
long
separate
period.
from major
Same kind
institutions.
of idea, when it didn't
But it's just,
finish when they thought it was, maybe they can just extend the date,
okay.
didn't automatically.
But this is as it applies to major.
Major institutions.
Yeah, I just felt like we'd just gone through this.
What we're proposing here is that when a master plan adopts an original, when an institution adopts an original master plan, they would propose a maximum amount of square footage they could add to their campus and a maximum number of parking spaces. And when and if they reach that number, then they would have to do a master plan. So say an institution comes in, does a master plan, they propose 100,000 square feet of new space. Through the years, they add 100,000 square feet. When they get to that level, then they have to do a new master plan in order to do new development on their campus.
Is there any ability for the city to reopen later?
That process.
If we've made a commitment and 60 years has passed and development hasn't happened, but everything else has changed in the neighborhood, and then they say, okay, now we're going to build out something that we got approval for 60 years ago, and all of our other codes and all of our other limits have changed,
We've all died.
and that's right. Is there any right for us to say, we'd like to have a conversation with you, even though we gave you this right 60 years ago, can we have a conversation?
We have one additional trigger that we put into the recommendations, and that is if after 10 years, the master plan's been in effect for 10 years, and the institution comes forward with some type of an amendment, may not necessarily trigger the new square footage as you're talking about or trigger the amount of parking spaces, but let's say it's a boundary change and the DPRU director determines that's a real significant change, then we could require the institution to do a whole new master plan after it's been in effect for at least 10 years. What you're talking about sounds like it would be going even further. It may not necessarily be a proposal that the institution has, but just that the surrounding neighborhood has changed drastically or significantly.
One of the things is that any project needs a master use permit, and it has to go through that process, and would have to have environmental review, and especially if the environmental conditions have changed since the environmental review on the master plan, it gives you a chance to look at that project if it doesn't, if it's a problem.
That's correct.
Okay, so that probably,
You're not,
yeah.
when you adopt the master plan, you have not issued a permit for every building. There is this master use permit system, and part of what they're trying to say is if you put all the details in your master plan, there's been a lot of review, then let's not do it all again if you're doing it right on schedule. But if you're doing it later, or if you didn't put the details in, maybe you need design review now. But you can maybe look at that, make sure that
If things have changed significantly and you would have new impacts that weren't anticipated in the original EIS or the original environmental review, DCRU would do additional environmental analysis to address those impacts. Finally, we're proposing a lot of other smaller recommendations that are intended to streamline the whole process. The process right now takes anywhere from like 2, 3, 4 years, and we're really hoping to keep it way below 2 years. And also some other...
below 2?
Under 2 years.
Under 2? Martha doesn't believe it's possible.
I think, we can look at a lot of the steps, and part of it is just if everybody's working together early on and you don't need to go back and forth and somebody gets 3 weeks to respond and then more time to...
And if you don't require as much information up front. One of the issues that driving the length of the process, though, is if an EIS is required for the master plan. But we do have some new regulations concerning the length of the EIS process through our regulatory reform legislation.
And also, they all have master plans. They're almost all of them now. And so the second master plan for a given institution, or the third one, should be a lot smoother. They've had a citizens advisory committee in place. They've got to work on things. Another piece of the time, also, be aware, is the council's review time. And in the code amendments that we put through in 1990, it had some, I don't know if there were exact limits, but there were specific, maybe there were limits for DCRU's review time and the hearing examiners, and then there was a goal for the council's review time, rather than the same kind of strict limit.
Which was 6 months.
Which was 6 months. And I know some of the institutions wanted a start to finish time, and so you all can police yourselves.
That's a perfect transition. We've actually proposed in the document, in our proposed report and ordinance, that we have time goals for each part of the process, not just for the whole thing and not for the part DCRU have, but for the Citizens Advisory Committee reviewing the preliminary draft, and for the institution to produce this document, and for DCRU to pump out the report.
Well, thank you for your work. We will be hearing more on this come the middle of July when we get a presentation. Obviously, we'll be interested in what the citizen response to your draft recommendations will be. Is there any questions at this time, or you want to hold them off till we get something more formal presented from the executive?
No, I don't have questions, but it seems that these recommendations are reasonable, logical, heading in the right direction. So far so good.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Keep up the good work. And with that, unless there is other business to come before the committee, we are adjourned.
Hour, which would put you, oh gosh, that would put you back within much better than the average, and probably only about twice the cost of the very low-cost guys. The low-cost guys in this segment, we're right at these guys down here at the very bottom, A and B, were around 13 cents a megawatt hour. So it puts you up in the 20, 25, not at the very top, but it puts you up there very much more competitive. And I see you shaking your head. That sounds right to you, too, then, too. So still a gap with the leaders, much better than average. In fact, by moving you out of that, you're probably actually going to decrease the average a little bit because this is such a small group. For Skagit, we may have some similar miscounting in there, but the order of magnitude was not nearly as much. That number for Skagit was about $400,000 and didn't look terribly out of line with what it was meant to have been in the first place, which was station service. So I think we got Skagit, and their public affairs and regulatory costs were accompanyingly, were higher too. So we might not have had the kind of miscount for Skagit. But even for that, now Skagit's in a different group. No, they're still in this group too. What's Skagit's letter?
Yeah, they're in, but that's
They're in.
prior to the revision.
Yeah. This is not the revised one where we move the costs. Okay. So we've got some revised pages where we did try to fix that for Skagit. The observation here in terms of what can you take away from this, with the data corrections, you're cheaper than average. That looks like a pretty good conclusion. But it's a little bit misleading to say you're cheaper than average in this group. And this is Boundary, this is Skagit. If you take those out, that basically leaves this data stream. You've got to be real careful about what you say cheaper than average in this group, because we have one participant who is greatly affecting the average. So this is one where averages kind of lie. This one bar moves this average line. I did a sensitivity analysis, almost 10 cents a megawatt hour, just because there's so few people in the group. I think what's real important in terms of lessons to take away from this, and it's a fundamental question, is how much more can we do with operations costs if we don't choose to automate these projects? So there's really kind of two parts there in terms of, are there improvement opportunities, Well, an obvious improvement opportunity is to fully automate these plants and take away the 24-hour-a-day operation of the plants. Now, you're not going to make that decision based on benchmarking. You're going to make that decision based on the cost-benefit analysis of what it costs to automate it and how much labor cost could you avoid. That's, pardon? Well, but I'm really talking about full automation and, you know, centralized dispatch by taking the cost out of that thing. I mean, in terms of the only way you could get additional benefit from the Skagit and full operations is basically reducing the number of plant operators away from the 24-hour-a-day operation. Your only opportunity to do that within City Light would be to move it to dispatch. And that, pardon?
Inspections and minor maintenance projects are kept in as operators, so it must be operation.
Okay. So there may be some miscounting in there too.
The numbers somewhat. When I looked at it, I can take those into consideration. Our operations costs are by no means the leaders, but are not either.
Yeah.
Way out of line.
So you may just be bumping up your economies of scope and scale, how much benefit you can get from dispatch there. And similarly, did you count the operators right, if you are? Ultimately, in terms of lessons learned, you're going to have to ask yourselves for Skagit and for Boundary too, can we afford to have specialized operator positions? Because in terms of lessons learned from other benchmark companies, while there was nobody in the large segment who had gone away totally from specialized operators, even Chelan, who had minimized falling operations, still had one operator in the plant on shift, one specialized operator in the large segment. But in the medium and the small segment, the way the leaders got down to that very, very low number was by combining operator and maintenance functions into a single classification. So that's the question you've got to pose yourself is, can we get some additional gains from the utilization of those people by making that move? And it's a question. Benchmarking doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the questions of which things should we be evaluating and what potential impact could it have on our total cost. So really, that's pretty much the lessons learned that we can glean out of this thing. We think once we get the data right, you're probably less than average. I mean, you're lower cost than average. What would it take to get to the leaders? Well, you're going to have to look at something more drastic for the Boundary, something that's, you know, even with the few number of operators you have up at the Boundary, you would have to look at something that took away their around-the-clock shifting up there. At the Skagit, you would have to look to get down to the levels that we saw of our other people of some kind of combined workforce kind of approach. And those are really questions. Those aren't answers. Those are, and I guess I want to speak a bit to that. What can we learn out of benchmarking? Can I give you a recommendation? I mean, one of the things that we've been very careful to talk about here is what we call this improvement opportunities. In benchmarking, we can show you relatively where you are relative to other participants in the group. We can tell you about other kinds of methods used by people in the group, and we give you the numbers and the perspective about that. But ultimately, all we can do is give you the roadmap and the evaluation criteria that let you ask yourself, would these same kind of things work in our own environment here? You know, I think benchmark is very powerful for that because it gives you specific examples of way people put their resources together to end up with different costs than you. I think it gives you a second thing, which is now you've got some benchmarking partners where if you decide you want to investigate further, you've got some very specific contacts about talking to them about how they structure to see if it might fit in your own environment too. But ultimately, it doesn't give you the final answer. It doesn't give you a recommendation that says do this. It gives you a pretty good roadmap for things you should be evaluating to put in your own environments.
Lonnie, how many hours of attended operation do we have at Skagit? Is it 7 10-hour days? How many hours a week of attended operation do we have at the Skagit?
Total man-hours, total hours.
7 10-hour days or
7 8-hour days.
7 8-hour days?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not quite 40, but it's not 40 hours.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is leaders in this segment basically don't specialize the attended operation. They make that a function of their on-site crews.
But they still have coverage 40 hours, so
Well, I won't even say that. They have coverage 40 hours. How many of those 40 hours are people actually doing operations? That's a good question. Because the problem with operator is you need coverage, but you don't necessarily have to have hands-on time of the whole coverage period. So I guess the other thing in terms of specific work method that I did point out that you may want to look for yourselves is the idea of not having a plant operator do your work protection process. By work protection, I'm talking about the actual clearance of equipment so that it can be worked on to be maintained. I mean, a very common practice we're seeing among low-cost performers here is that the operator maintainers, or whatever you call that person who's left in the station, does their own clearance, then they work on the equipment. It's not separately assigned functions. And that can be done very, very safely. It really is a procedural issue. It really is a procedural issue, but there are a lot of examples of companies who have their crews doing their own work protection and doing it very safely. Now, the question is, again, is that something you would want to look at for yourselves, especially given your recently implemented lockout tagout? Lonnie, you may want to talk a bit to lockout tagout. That came out. You know, not everybody in Washington's moving to lockout tagout yet.
Well, very, very good. Mr. Muntz here, he can speak on that, but for it to be a regulated law, there's very few people that follow the law.
Right.
Really not.
Yeah, the way people are administering that law is not necessarily by putting locking mechanisms on everything and giving locks out.
Nor making procedures, nor checking their performances, nor any of that.
Right.
Very, very good.
In fact, some of our counterparts in the system are basically saying we'll wait until they come and tell us.
Yeah. Now, outside the state of Washington, we do have participants.